Hi, this is Jim Leffler, uh, continuing the Psychodynamic Psychotherapy Technique course, session 4A. I'll also have a 4B where we explore some specific elements of countertransference data. But 4A, so treating countertransference as data. Quickly to review, we have worked on moving through what is a psychoanalytic psychodynamic psychotherapy. If you'll recall, it's depth-oriented. It really focuses on a patient perspective, which is what we did in session 1. It's patient-directed. That's session 2. And then sessions 3 and moving here to 4, we're talking about exploring various different emotional dynamics, relational dynamics, etc., and attunement to the therapeutic process. And as I said, each of those elements have been drawn out and explored by different authors, different schools within psychoanalysis, whether it's the relational school, intersubjective school, self-psychology school, Kleinian school, Behonian school, Winnicottian, etc. They all kind of explore one of these different aspects of the person's mind, etc. After we move into session 5, we'll be thinking about mechanics of change, really, and how those can be used to deepen the exploration. So we talked about transference last time in session 3. We're going to talk about the other half of the room today in countertransference, and I'm going to try to review the classical stance on how to approach countertransference. And then there was this shift by Paula Hyman, and there may have been others, but that's what stands out in my mind as one of the most important figures to call attention to a different way of approaching countertransference, and we'll go through it. So it's a hypothetical 4th visit. So a patient who's pretty bright, articulate, and polished, their history's clean, everything seems fine. However, 3 minutes into the interview, you, the analyst, therapist, physician, you feel small. And you find that you don't often have to do this, but you feel like you have to reach for the right word and it just doesn't seem to come. Then continuing in the session, that feeling deepens. And by the end of the session, you're just flat tired from how hard it was to kind of present. Now, there's some options in becoming aware of what was going on. 1, you just had a bad day, you write it off, you move forward. 2, you see it as your problem and you accept the personal narcissistic injury that it was, and you plan to go talk to your own therapist or analyst about what happened. That's never a bad idea to help you explore things. But both of those close down what could be going on. They kind of give a reason and move forward. 3 and 4 is kind of what we're talking about today. You can treat that feeling as data about what's going on for the patient. And 4, you can treat it as the patient's actual communication about something they cannot yet think. So it's data about what they're trying to communicate, and it could actually be what is happening on the unconscious, latent level that neither of you can quite yet put into words. So countertransference. Classically, this was and is the therapist's own. So countertransference is the experience of the therapist having thoughts, feelings, emotions, reactions to the person in front of them, influenced by their own history. And classically, the thought was that you went into analysis, and by going through an analysis, you addressed all of your neuroses, so you wouldn't have countertransference. And if countertransference arises, that is something you then need to go and seek further analysis for. Hyman in the 1950s doesn't disagree with, as I just said, it's always a good idea to, if you're having trouble or something surprising comes up, to seek further counsel. That could be peer supervision, it could be further analysis, self-analysis, but also wanted to actually shift it and say perhaps the emotional response in the room isn't noise, it's actually the information. And the technical shift is moving away from this absolute neutrality that establishes the frame, and anything that's arising in you needs to be kind of set aside so that you can stay attentive to the patient, but that it becomes an inner noticing. and that your experience as the therapist with this patient is actually a primary instrument, because what arises in you is at least partly, if not completely, at that any given time, the patient's communication, more so than their words. Just to read the way Paula Heinemann said it, I would suggest that the analyst, along with an evenly suspended attention, which we talked about, and that's the analyst's side of kind of free association, an evenly suspended attention, needs a freely aroused emotional sensibility so as to follow the patient's emotional movements and unconscious fantasies. The pH there is specific to the Kleinian movement. I'm not going to talk about that, but that's intentional. It's kind of like having a broader understanding of people's view of the world, that they live out a fantasy, and the pH was chosen because it's kind of a total way of seeing the world, almost like living in an individual's very own matrix, so to speak. Our basic assumption is that the analyst's unconscious understands that of his patients, and forgive the gendered language, this is just from the actual text. This rapport on the deep level comes to the surface in the form of feelings which the analyst notices in response to his patient in his countertransference. This is the most dynamic way in which his patient's voice reaches him. In the comparison of feelings roused in himself with his patient's associations and behavior, the analyst possesses a most valuable means of checking whether he has failed to understand or not, whether he has failed to understand or understand his patient. So what does that data actually look like? You can think of it as 4 things to take note of: affect, body, action urges, and self states. Affect. So what is your emotional experience? That could be a boredom, an irritation, a sleepiness, a dread, a sudden tenderness, the urge to laugh, to weep. Your body, you may feel a heaviness, a tightness, a restlessness, even an urge to leave the room. And I realize I've already written sleepiness up here, but here it is again. You could feel a sleepiness and fatigue in the body that isn't related to last night's sleep. Action urges, the urge to rescue, explain, terminate, start a medication, change a medication, reassure, send a message in between sessions. There could be a self state. What does this mean? So self state is actually, this is a different, dang it, I know this is confusing, and I'm wishing now I'd used a different word here, but this one's fine. So this comes out of like relational psychology, relational depth psychology within the psychoanalytic world, that people can exist in different states, in a self state. So you can shift from existing one way and having one way of being in one context circumstance, and that may shift if you're in a different context circumstance. So you have like a professional life, a domestic life, a way you interact with your parents, and a way you interact with your kids, and a way you interact with your wife, that actually can feel like really separate beings and people. And some of the work in that is like, how do you integrate those into a whole, while also recognizing that there's probably some utility in having different ways of relating. So anyway, so you notice a change in your self state. You go from generally feeling, say, like organized, well prepared, engaged, an expert psychiatrist, to now feeling small, or maybe you actually feel overbearing, and usually your stance is actually a bit more pulled back and reserved. Sometimes you could feel like you're the only adult in the room. But if there's a shift into that, it may be data. And so once you're aware, there's 3 possibilities. There's probably more than this, but these are the ones that kind of come to mind. So some of it's going to belong to the patient, some of it belongs to the therapist, and some belongs to the field. And what do I mean by field? And we'll talk about that more as we progress and think about other ideas within psychoanalytic theory. But the field would be a space, a mental space that exists when the patient and therapist are together. No 2 mental space is the same, because no 2 pairs are the same. And the space actually can shift from day to day. But within that space, which is like a sum that's greater than its parts, an emotion itself can arise within that that's not really owned by one or the other, but just happened here within this field. You maybe have read some of Bion's work about groups or thought about group psychology, and it's kind of those effects that there could be, like, say, a mob mentality or something like that that wouldn't exist if you didn't have the mob. But when you notice these things and you wonder about it, you can ask, what just happened in the room that led this feeling to arrive? And that can give you data, and that would be countertransferential data.